See those numbers drastically reduced in the coming days.
The U.S. on high alert tonight as the White House warns another terror attack in Kabul is likely.
The threat is ongoing and it is active. Our troops are still in danger.
The death toll from the airport bombing in Afghanistan is now at 170 civilians and 13 U.S. service members. President Biden's national security team warned him today that more attacks are expected.
The mission there being performed is dangerous.
Despite the new threats, the president is vowing to move ahead with the evacuation efforts.
We will complete the mission.
With just 4 days before Biden's August 31st deadline, Afghans are scrambling to find a way out as U.S. forces prepare to leave with equipment and resources in tow.
This is the most dangerous part of the mission. This is the retrograde period of the mission. There will be a reduction of numbers over the next couple of days.
The State Department says there are at least 500 Americans still in Afghanistan who want to leave.
There are approximately 500 American citizens we are currently working with.
After the suicide bomber slipped past Taliban fighters, some Democrats are criticizing the Biden administration's unusual reliance on the militia group to secure the airport perimeter.
We don't trust the Taliban. This is not about trust, but there is a reality on the ground. And the reality is the Taliban control large swaths of Afghanistan.
One Republican lawmaker is calling on some of Biden's top aides to resign following the deadly withdrawal, though officials say that's not under consideration.
I do believe some people on his national security team should resign. That's up to them and it's up to him.
There's just not a lot of time for self-reflection right now. The focus is really on the task at hand.
The president has promised to hunt down those responsible for the suicide blast. Today, he was updated on the Pentagon's plans to strike ISIS-K, the Islamic State affiliate, claiming credit for the attack.
I think he made clear yesterday that he does not want them to live on the earth anymore.
And Wolf, we also got an update from the State Department this afternoon saying that they believe they have the, quote, vast majority of locally employed U.S. Embassy staff either evacuated or prepared to evacuate from that airport in Kabul as this mission comes to an end. We did just get updated numbers from the White House on what those evacuation numbers looked like today. And from 3 a.m. Eastern this morning to 3 p.m. Eastern this afternoon, they say 4,200 total people were evacuated from Kabul. Those are 12 U.S. military flights, Wolf, with 2,100 people, and 29 coalition flights. Those are with allies. They were carrying about 2,100 people as well. So, like Jen Psaki cautioned in the briefing today, you are already starting to see those numbers go down as they switch and move this to more focusing on getting troops out of there and getting those resources out of Kabul as well.
And that increases the number of people who have been evacuated from Afghanistan since August 1 to 109,200 evacuees. All right, Caitlin, thank you very, very much. Let's go to the region right now. Our chief international correspondent, Clarissa Ward, is joining us. Clarissa, so what are you learning about the scene around the Kabul airport today?
Well, Wolf, what a difference a day makes. It was startling to see just how quiet things were on the streets around the airport today, particularly around Abbey Gate, where that explosion took place. And that's partly because what the Taliban has essentially done now is pushed its perimeter further away from the outside of the airport. They are basically trying to block people from getting close to where those U.S. servicemen and ordinary Afghan civilians and indeed Taliban fighters were killed in that explosion yesterday. And to be honest, their task is made a lot simpler, Wolf, by the fact that many Afghans are now very afraid to go and try to get to the airport. And this is something that, of course, is complicating those evacuation efforts. We heard the White House earlier saying that they estimate around 500 U.S. nationals are in Afghanistan and wanting to leave. But understandably, people now have real concerns about trying to get to the airport because even though yesterday's attack it's been much calmer today, there is still the protracted threat of another ISIS-K attack. This is something that Western security officials have been warning about and anticipating for quite some time. And you can see, Wolf, how it was able to happen when you think that this choke point with thousands of Afghans with U.S. forces searching them at very close quarters was continuing for days and even over a week. giving ISIS-K and potentially other groups as well abundant time to sort of recce the situation and see the best way to get their weaponry or their explosives past the Taliban. And it is worth mentioning as well, Wolf, when we were on the ground outside the airport and when we traveled to the airport, the primary thing that the Taliban was looking for when you were trying to get past that initial checkpoint was the appropriate form of documentation to show that you could leave the country. Weaponry was a secondary consideration. Many people not even undergoing cursory pat-downs as they go through to that next line, which is, of course, U.S. forces conducting those searches at very close quarters, leaving them very vulnerable. And as we mentioned before, of course, anyone who wants to travel to the airport now also feeling exceptionally vulnerable, Wolf.
Clarissa, as you know, the White House has said the United States has no choice but to depend on the Taliban to keep the evacuation mission going over these next few days. But can the Taliban really control the terror threat that's obviously out there?
Well, Wolf, I think this is a question not just for the coming days as we approach this deadline, but this is a broader question going forward. The whole premise of the U.S. withdrawal was predicated on this promise from the Taliban that they would not allow Afghanistan to once again become a safe haven for terrorists. And what you have seen quite clearly with yesterday's attack is that a group like ISIS-K, which had been lying low for a little bit of time, but we have certainly seen them launch hideous, grotesque attacks against civilians in Jalalabad, in Kabul, they are still able to operate with some level of impunity on the ground. And something that many viewers might not realize is that the Taliban and ISIS-K are enemies as well. ISIS-K is attacking the Taliban all the time, meaning that the Taliban is now finding itself in a situation where it's having to put out multiple fires at the same moment, all in the initial weeks of its first attempts at governance since the late 90s. And so the question really does become now, does the Taliban have the security forces, the intelligence services, and the wherewithal to keep track of groups like ISIS-K and prevent these types of attacks from happening, not just in the coming days as the U.S. completes its withdrawal, but in the long-term future as well?
Clarissa, I want you to stay with us. We're going to have you back in just a moment, but there's some other important news we're following right now. I want to bring in our national security correspondent, Kylie Atwood. Kylie, how many Americans are in Afghanistan right now and still want to come home?
Yeah, State Department said today that there are 500 Americans that they are in direct contact with in Afghanistan working to evacuate them. It looks like those are all Americans in the country that want to leave the country. There's another group, however, Wolf, of about 100 Americans, several hundred Americans potentially, according to the State Department, that haven't made up their mind. They're Americans who potentially have friends or relatives in the country, and they have not told the U.S. that they want to leave. Now, of course, the State Department is saying that those folks still have a commitment from the United States, even when the U.S. military withdraws on August 31st, that they will try and help them get out. But they also acknowledge that the tactics are going to change. Exactly how the United States would get those Americans out of the country after August 31st remains quite unclear. And the other group of Americans still in the country, in addition, of course, to the U.S. military presence, are those U.S. diplomats. It's a small number of diplomats, because you'll recall that about 2 weeks ago, the whole entire embassy was evacuated, but some diplomats stayed, and they're helping to run the operations at the airport right now, process visas, do that kind of thing as Afghans get on these evacuation flights. Now, what we're told is that over the weekend, a significant number of those diplomats are going to leave the country. And then there are also preparations underway at the State Department for a full evacuation of all of those diplomats. Now, the State Department isn't officially saying that they are drawing down their diplomatic presence completely. You'll recall that the Biden administration repeatedly said that they were going to keep their diplomats in the country. Well, the fact that they're preparing to withdraw everyone is a reflection of the reality, of course. It's too unsafe. The U.S. military presence won't be there. And
And the other thing to point out, of course, is it doesn't look like the airport will be functioning fully. The U.S. military is running that right now, and U.S. diplomats cannot stay in a country, according to a senior State Department official, if there's no way to get out by air or by water. And of course, Kabul and Afghanistan as a country is landlocked. So if that airport isn't working, those diplomats have no other way to safely get out of the country. They're also going to have to leave.
All right, Kylie, thanks for that update. Kylie Atwood at the State Department. I want to bring back Clarissa, along with retired General Leslie Clark. He's the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and CNN military analyst. Also with us, Ian Bremmer, a political scientist and president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. And joining us tonight, Lisa Curtis, the former National Security Council Senior Director for South and Central Asia. To all of you, thanks so much for joining us. General Clark, another terror attack. The White House says it's likely. They say these next few days between now and Tuesday will be the most dangerous period to date. So what are they bracing for exactly?
So more of the same. So the perimeter's been expanded. That makes it more difficult. A truck bomb, a mortar attack, rocket attack. And as these forces are drawn down, who knows, maybe even a ground assault by a group of ISIS-K fighters. You've got to be prepared for any and all of that. And of course it is dangerous because once we start to draw down troops, we have less response capability. Now obviously we're going to do everything we can to put overhead assets there to monitor from the air, to be ready to strike back and defend from the air, but it's not the same as having the troops on the ground.
And they're also worried about a potential shoulder-fired or surface-to-air missile that could take down a plane taking off from that Kabul airport. And a day after the deadly attack yesterday, the Pentagon now clarifying this was one bombing, one suicide bombing, not two, and the death toll has risen to nearly...
Hell yeah, I wish I could see the whole outfit.
Well, I mean, this is not worst case yet at this point, right? I mean, clearly the ability, they were able to warn the civilians, American civilians, a few hours in advance. They all got out, and they're very concerned that those 500 American civilians that are left that are trying to evacuate, what happens to them? But this was the worst 24 hours of the Biden administration to date, there's no question, and they are bracing for it to be worse. They know that the images that come out of Afghanistan on 9/11 with a Taliban flag on top of the American embassy at that point, with American material, Black Hawks, other equipment being, sort of paraded around the country, and the fact that Biden now has to engage in some kind of direct force to go after the bad guys. So he's pulling out, he's ending the war in Afghanistan, but we're still in principle fighting the war in Afghanistan. This is unfortunately for Biden, right? I mean, if he'd been able to avoid terrorist attacks and American service members getting killed, he probably could have avoided long-term domestic political fallout in the United States. That's sadly, the Biden administration no longer possible at this point.
Yeah, that's an important point. Lisa.
Oh my God, the talk to text just picked up what my podcast was saying. Where did you go wearing that? Question mark.
Presence on the ground, and the U.S. can rely on their goodwill and the fact that they do have relationships with the Taliban to be able to continue to get people out, to continue those evacuations. Certainly it will be much more difficult, but it will still be possible. And don't forget, the U.S. will have leverage, even though that leverage will be less without U.S. troops on the ground. We still have financial leverage with the Taliban. The U.S. has frozen $9 billion in Afghan central bank assets. The IMF has cut off funding to Afghanistan. There are UN sanctions on Taliban leaders. So we still have leverage that we can use to get both American citizens that might be left behind as well as Afghan allies, even when our troops return home.
You know, Clarissa, it looks like the U.S. May not have any diplomatic presence in Kabul after Tuesday. That's when all U.S. troops have to withdraw. So what happens to Afghans trying to get out after Tuesday, trying to apply for special immigrant visas or some other way if there's no formal diplomatic presence on the ground?
Well, this is what the United Nations is bracing for, Wolf, and they've already said they expect potentially in the coming months 500,000 Afghans to be flooding out or attempting to flood out of the country. They're asking all neighboring countries to keep their borders open as they basically prepared for a deluge of displaced people who are desperately trying to get out. Now, we did hear from the State Department earlier that the Taliban has pledged to keep its borders open, that the Taliban is saying that people can come and go as they please, but that's simply not what we're really seeing and hearing on the ground. And, you know, there's a whole other category of Afghans that we need to be talking about here who may not have been directly working for the U.S. government or the U.S. military, but who nonetheless are prominent human rights activists, women's rights activists, people of that nature who are currently under house arrest. And I don't want to name names at the moment because I don't want to make their situations any worse than it already is. But let me just say that there have been ongoing diplomatic efforts to evacuate some of these people, and so far there is no sense that the Taliban is budging on this at all. So we may well see something of a purge against these types of activists, human rights, women's rights, etc. in the coming months, Wolf.
Yeah, that's what so many people are fearing. General Clark, the withdrawal is a transition. It's not like flipping a light switch. So what's the military on the ground in Kabul doing between now and, shall we say, Tuesday, the deadline for complete U.S. military withdrawal?
Well, first of all, they're providing security as best they can around the airport. They're collecting intelligence, they're watching things, they're on guard, they're packing up. It takes a lot longer to get out of an expeditionary situation like this than it takes to get in. So stuff's got to be prepared for air movement, got to figure out how to retrograde in a logical way. So what gets moved first, what stays till the end. And so there's going to be a lot of planning that's going on, a lot of leadership attention devoted to getting out in a smooth fashion. There'll be still people coming in, maybe, although I'm reading in the press that the gates are locked, that no one's getting in, that there's a few thousand people left at the airport that will be evacuated. So we can't tell what the actual process is going to be for bringing more people in and how many more can get in. I'm hearing from my sources, people texting and other things, that they cannot get into the airfield right now, even some American citizens. So there's going to be a real pressure on the troops on the ground to figure out a way to get these last few Americans in and get them in safely.
You know, Ian, I know you say that this massive terror attack that we saw yesterday, as a result of that, you say President Biden is now, in your words, all but certain to pay a political price. What do you expect?
Well, I expect that in the north, this is worse than Benghazi, which was, of course, incredibly politicized by the Republicans in a very for a long time. I mean, I think the midterm elections, at this point, our assessment is probably a 40-seat swing to the GOP in the House. And when you talk to senior members of the Democratic caucus, they recognize that this is a serious problem for them. In other words, you've seen President Biden's approval ratings take a hit over the last couple of weeks. A big part of that up till now was the Delta variant and people just getting more fearful about how coronavirus is going, something that you can't really just put on Biden's watch, but of course, he's the president. The next set of approval ratings you're going to see are going to play in the fact that this is seen as a debacle, and Biden says he owns it. He does own it. He can be blamed for it. And of course, no one's going to give him an inch among those that don't support the Biden administration. So I do think that this ends up playing out in a significant and painful way. If he can get the trillions of dollars through an infrastructure spend, which we still expect he will, that's going to make a difference. But I do think now, come 2022, Afghanistan and Biden in charge of the Afghanistan withdrawal, with the war on terror still going on, with the images is still emblazoned, it's the only thing that's really taken us away from the pandemic, except the events of January 6th, in a year and a half now, Wolf. I do think it plays into the election for him. I actually do.
Yeah, one positive thing is that 110,000 people have been evacuated since August 14th. It's a lot of people that are going to have new lives outside of Afghanistan. I'm sure all of them are very, very grateful for that. Lisa, are Afghans starting to get a better sense of what life will look like under the Taliban rule after the last U.S. troops leave on Tuesday?
Well, the Taliban has gone on sort of a media campaign. Even the spokesperson for the Taliban, Zabiul Majid, addressed the media last week, and he said all the right things. He said that girls would be allowed to go to school, women would be allowed to work, there would not be reprisal killings. So they're putting on a good face. But the problem is, on the ground, we see something different. We see lists floating around. We see Taliban knocking on doors. So people are still very fearful. There's a lot of uncertainty. I think there is an opportunity for the United States and its allies to try to shape what's going to happen and move forward. But people are scared. They're fearful.
And understandably so, indeed. All right, guys, thank you very, very much. Just ahead, we're going to discuss the risk of more U.S. military casualties in Kabul and the Biden administration's strategy with an Afghanistan war veteran now serving in the U.S. Congress. Stay with us. You're in The Situation.
Angie's List is now Angie. Whether you need help with routine maintenance or you're planning your dream renovation, Angie connects you with top local pros who can get the job done right. It's easy to see reviews, compare quotes, and instantly book hundreds of projects. Plus, when you book and pay through Angie, they'll cover your project up to the full purchase price, plus limited damage protection with their happiness guarantee. Check out Angie.com, and for more on the happiness guarantee, go to Angie.com/happiness-guarantee.htm.
This podcast is supported by First Republic Bank. Now, more than ever, First Republic's priority is serving their clients and communities. Their personalized banking solutions go deeper than a transaction. For over 30 years, First Republic has striven to leave a positive impact on the communities that they serve. From presenting grants to nonprofits in need of going the extra mile, to connecting individuals experiencing hardship with fair loans, the bank is focused on doing the right thing. No matter what your financial goals are, your dedicated First Republic banker will be there to guide you every step of the way. Visit firstrepublic.com today to learn more. That's firstrepublic.com. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.
A chilling warning from the White House today saying another terror attack in Kabul is likely as the U.S. mission to evacuate Americans enters, and I'm quoting now, the most dangerous period just ahead of the completion of U.S. withdrawal next Tuesday. Joining us now to discuss all of this, Democratic Congressman Jason Crow of Colorado. He's a key member of both the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees. He's a former U.S. Army Ranger who served in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for your service to our country. How does the U.S. military try to thwart yet another deadly bombing like the one yesterday that killed 13 American service members?
Yeah, thanks, Wolf. This is a terrible tragedy, and I mourn with all of America for the loss of these 13 service members, and I extend my sympathies to their families, and we, of course, as a country, will continue to support those families in the years ahead. Afghanistan is a dangerous place. It's been a dangerous place for 20 years now. We have lost 2,400 young men and women over the last 2 decades. And that's one of the reasons why I agree with the administration and the president that it was time to bring our troops home. But this isn't the first time we've had an ISIS attack, and it won't be the last. This is a dangerous situation, and this mission is not without risk. But the mission must continue. Now, every time we've lost a soldier over the last 20 years, those over 2,000 young men and women, they were always on a mission. But we never stopped that mission because we don't allow terrorists, we don't allow our adversaries and our enemies to tell us when to stop a mission. The mission is we have to bring our Americans home. We can't leave American citizens behind who want to come home, and our Afghan partners. We have to get that job done.
but the president is vowing to complete the mission. He's not budging from the Tuesday deadline for the full withdrawal of all remaining U.S. troops in Afghanistan. You had called on him to push back the withdrawal. Do you still want him to extend this mission, knowing U.S. troops right now clearly in harm's way?
But this isn't about extending the mission. This is about actually accomplishing the mission. Accomplishing the mission requires that we bring Americans home. Accomplishing the mission requires that we actually do that. That doesn't end tomorrow, August 31st, September 2nd, September 3rd, until we actually bring the folks home. I've been pushing the administration to actually make sure that we define the mission success as bringing Americans home and saving our Afghan partners who wish to come to safety and who qualify for that evacuation. It should not be a calendar deadline. And I think it's really important here that we not allow terrorists to dictate the terms of what our mission has to be, what our moral and legal obligation is to our own people, that we actually define that mission, that we put the resources in place to get it done.
So what should happen after the Tuesday deadline?
Well, we continue the mission until it gets done, and that is not without risk. We've been saying all along, this is risky. Afghanistan is an extremely risky place. And those servicemen who died yesterday gave their life in pursuit of liberty and freedom, just like the president said. And we have to make sure that we are doing everything possible to put the troops and resources in place to protect them, to protect that airport, to extend that perimeter, put air cover in place, have the intelligence capability to detect these attacks in advance, and do everything possible. That this is imperfect stuff. We're asking these folks to do very difficult things under very difficult circumstances, and certainly not without risk. But that doesn't mean that we stop the mission, because we cannot, and must not ever leave hundreds of Americans behind who have raised their hand and said that they want to be evacuated. And I'm getting stories, even today, just a couple hours ago, I talked to somebody on the phone that says they have 4 Americans that haven't heard from the State Department in days, who are waiting for evacuation. They don't know what's going to happen. I'm hearing a lot of those stories. And I do not see a path to getting that done between now and Tuesday. That's why we have to not have this deadline of Tuesday be the deadline. It has to be the accomplishment of the mission. And there are moments like this in a crisis. We can't allow this crisis to take on a life of its own. We have to sometimes take a step back, take the deep breath that we need to take, and say, we're going to control this situation. We're going to do what's necessary to put the resources in place, and we're going to get the mission done.
The mission will be done in terms of the military on Tuesday, then it's over. So what you're suggesting is that over the horizon, there's going to be a U.S. military presence outside of Afghanistan that occasionally can come in and complete various military operations?
No, I'm suggesting that we not withdraw our military forces by Tuesday. And I've said that all along to the administration. When we withdraw our military forces and our boots on the ground, our abilities, the options we have available to us, drastically shrink. And our ability to safely and successfully get American citizens and Afghan partners out of the country become extremely diminished. And what I'm saying is that we should not constrain ourselves like that. We have an obligation to get our people out, and we should not be forced to reduce our capability significantly on Tuesday just because of the calendar deadline.
Yeah, well, on that issue, you clearly disagree with the president. He says all U.S. troops will definitely be removed from Afghanistan by Tuesday. We'll see what happens. But once again, Congressman Crow, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks again for your service to our country. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Let's get a closer look right now at the group ISIS-K, the terror group claiming responsibility for the Kabul airport attacks. CNN's Brian Todd is joining us right now. Brian, ISIS-K has a very bloody and ruthless track record.
It does, Wolf, a more extensive track record of these kinds of attacks than many of us knew about previously. And with the latest attack in Kabul, look for ISIS-K to draw some new support from other jihadist groups. We have to warn viewers, some may find some of the video in this story disturbing. Carnage and slaughter in Kabul. The claim of responsibility coming from ISIS-K, a group claiming to be a branch of the main ISIS network, which swept through Syria and Iraq in 2014. A terror force with the means and motive to launch attacks like this.
ISIS-K is known for attacks that are able to slaughter a large number of civilians. This includes suicide bombings. They've had for some time an attack network that operates within Kabul.
Analysts say ISIS-K has had no qualms about murdering innocents in their pursuit of a caliphate in Afghanistan. In May of this year, they attacked a school for girls in Kabul, killing at least 85 people, according to Afghan officials, most of them girls. In June, an ISIS-K attack on a British-American demining charity killed at least 10 people. But even then, they weren't beginners.
Back in November, an hours-long assault at Kabul University that killed 22, a suicide bombing at an education center in October that killed 24, and a gun attack on a hospital maternity ward back in May of 2020 that also resulted in 24 fatalities. All of that shows a capable militant network.
But there are other terror networks in Afghanistan as well, experts say, extremist movements allied with al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and other cells which pose a threat inside Afghanistan and beyond.
One of them, for example, is a Uyghur extremist group that has been very active.